My name is Alpha Esser, and I'm a technical trainer here at the Duke Clinical Research Institute, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce our guest speakers today. Dr. Marco Polo Hernández Cuevas is a tenured full professor of Spanish language and literature, Afro-Mexican, Afro-Hispanic, and Afro-Latina studies. He holds a Ph.D. in Hispanic and Italian studies from the University of British Columbia, a M.A. in Spanish language and Peninsular and Latin American literatures, and a B.A. in General Studies in Spanish Language and Literatures from Portland State University. Is that it?
Yeah.
He has written 7 books in English and Spanish: African Mexicans in the Discourse on Modern Nation, Africa and Mexican Carnival, Africa and Mexico, a Repudiated Heritage, The Africanization of Mexico from the 16th Century Onward, a Review of the Evidence, Eternity, a collection of his own poetry, The Afro-Mexican Ancestors in the Nation They Constructed, and A Matter of Luck, a collection of his short stories. Dr. Hernández has produced and directed a series of short films. In addition, he founded and directs the Mexican Institute of Africana Studies and the YouTube channel Africana Studies. He has lectured in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. He's an African-Mexican native of Mexico City's inner ghettos, and Chilango, an Afro-Hispanic language, is his first language. Dr. Hernández is also a chef de cuisine and gastronome by trade. His research interests include Africana and Afro-Latin cultures and literatures with specialization in 19th and 20th century African-Mexican culture, popular culture, gastronomy and literature, transatlantic studies, diaspora studies, post-colonial studies, contemporary critical theories, mass media persuasion, Caribbean studies, and cross-cultural and multicultural studies. Mrs. Kimberly R. Hernández is a Spanish language and culture instructor at North Carolina Central University since 2005. She informs her teaching from her collaboration with Dr. Marco Polo Hernández Cuevas' research and her experiences concerning the Afro-Mexican, Afro-Hispanic, and Afro-Latina culture sites of Spanish-speaking communities. Mrs. Hernández has an M.A. in Hispanic and Italian Studies from the University of British Columbia and a B.A. in General Studies, as well as a B.A. in Spanish Language and Literatures from Portland State University. She has co-produced with Dr. Hernández a series of short films found in the YouTube channel Africana Studies. Her research interests include Africana and Afro-Latina cultures and literatures, Afrocentric critical theory, identify forming gastronomy, mass media persuasion, and cross-cultural and multicultural studies. That was a mouthful. Please welcome Dr. Marco Polo Hernández Cuevas and his wife, Ms. Kimberly R. Hernández. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an honor to be here. We want to make sure and thank, first of all, for the invitation here at the DCRI, and Gina Streety, and the director, Eric Peterson, and of course, Brent Lyon for the technical support, and Alpha for the beautiful introduction. So thank you so much. We appreciate coming and sharing our experience and our research with you. Dr. Hernandez?
So, one of the things that I wanted to set off this meeting with, because it's not a lecture, it's a meeting, so I would expect you to like throw volleys at us so we can try to answer, right? But some photographs that were recently published because of the earthquakes that we experienced in Mexico, well, that day, because I wasn't there, luckily I was here, but this includes also a set of photographs that are common Mexican folk that would look more like the people that you see here every day, right? Well, that's our hero, General Zapata, after he was murdered. That's while he was alive. You can see General Francisco Villa as well. But this photograph is the one that infuriated me because it was produced. Those are the real people. That's how they look. But if you wait until the other photograph comes around, if you were to get into the media and you look at Univision and you look at one of those terrible soap operas that nevertheless everybody spends the whole, including me every now and then, watching the whole thing, right? And people don't look like me. You know, people, when I talk to them, say, well, you look like Emiliano Zapata, or you look like Pancho Villa. And so, well, that's what Mexicans look like. But is it really a matter of appearance, right? Is it a matter of genealogy? Do we look one way or the other way given to a real issue? And yeah, it's a real issue, racism. Biologically, we know, particularly you know, because you're a scientist, I'm from the soft sciences, right? We just discovered not long ago in the 80s that there was only one race, and that's because biology did inform us. But, shockingly so, in our schools, we still teaching races. And I'm saying our schools because all the colonial thing, all the way from Africa to Cuba, my favorite place, they still teaching that curriculum. And, these myths about races are so pervasive that we actually believe it. Now, I have colleagues who explain to me that this is a social construct. Well, great. But it's not biology. It's a social construct. This means that you may appear totally black and you are more European than you think, genetically speaking, or that you appear as an indigenous person and you are more African, according to the 3% of genes, than one realizes. But how does this affect us psychologically? Because during my dissertation, the first book, I concluded that Mexicans suffer what I call the false identity syndrome. We believe we are something that we are not. And if you talk to the common Mexican person, and I've shown this photograph, and they don't see anything wrong with it. When I show it to them, well, okay. And, when you compare it with the other photographs, there is a big gap. My mentor said it would be nice if we could just go on our business, and now that we know we are only one race, the human race, and forget about everything else. But he also said this will not be possible until we make up for all the damages and destruction that was caused by the other way of thinking. Well, one of the big problems in Mexico and Latin America is that we believe in a so-called miscegenation. And this implies in itself that there are pure races, otherwise you cannot have any kind of mixture. And people also believe that we are the product of two races, Spanish race, whatever that is, and an indigenous race. So what happened to the African genes? Now, most people don't know that Mexico received hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans during what was called the first period of the transatlantic trade. This 1492 until about 1640. 1640, Portugal and Spain separated. They went each one their own way. And during that period, a large amount of Africans were kidnapped and taken to the so-called New World. Not to forget that thousands of originary people were taken to Europe and to Africa before the African transatlantic trade began. But nevertheless, that's a different conversation. So we should keep in mind that the first hundreds of thousands of people that were brought into this continent, into the islands, and then into the mainland would end up in Mexico. So at around 1640, there were no less than 150,000 Africans living in Mexico already, and of course their offspring. So what happened to all of these folks? What happened to the Africans that continued to be taken into Mexico to lesser numbers as the operation grew elsewhere in the continent? But if you ask the common Mexican and you talk about racism, we point towards the United States. Not to say that racism doesn't exist here. Just to say that racism in Mexico has its own quota, and we cannot ignore it, particularly when Mexico now has come into contact a lot stronger, not because of the trade agreement, but because of labor crossing the border. And this is something that we need to understand here. This diversity needs to be understood. Latinos have tried to sue other Latinos in court for discrimination, and people say, you're crazy, you cannot discriminate one Latino against the other Latino. Well, Latinos are not homogeneous looking people. We are very different too. And we have some people that look very African, because unfortunately, that's what's in the mind. There are other people who look very indigenous. Unfortunately, that's what's in the mind. Other people that look very white, as you can see in the photograph that has been going through. And other people that look very Asian, but by the way, we had an Asian colony in Mexico since 1570s. But this is not known, this is not discussed. And what are the effects of this diversity now that we come into contact with a society, a country that takes into consideration such a diversity? And how does this affect research? Because I remember in the 90s, 2000s, when in Oregon, we had this similar discussion, because they were making medications. They were talking about medication for Hispanics. And that's the first time that it hit me. I'm like, Hispanics, a different group than African Americans? And, how can that be? And that was advertised like that. And medical research taking place, looking at Hispanic people and, trying to, recently, 10 years ago, there was this Mexican genome developed. We actually had some institute of, that was opened in Mexico to determine the Mexican genome. And this is what? They took samples from 6 different states, students from universities, and so they came up with this map where from the sample 300 students, the ones who showed to have the least African genes in them were somewhere from 5 to 15%. So under the one-drop rule, that meant that everyone was black. But in Mexico, we look at things different. If you can prove that you have one drop that is not African, then you are something else. That's a way to escape that Africanness. Why do Latinos run so far and so fast from Africa? Because the idea that we have of Africa is a very nasty one. Lions, tigers, giraffes, people with bones in their nose. And continue to have that idea, notwithstanding the large cities, all of the brilliant people who populate that continent. We still have that ignorant view. But anyway, I don't want to make this too long of a conversation. I would like to open the floor for questions that you may have on what I have said so far. ¿They don't need it? Okay.
Professor, mucho gusto.
Gusto es mío.
You have been talking about Mexico, but you shared that view for both Latin America?
I'm sorry, I couldn't
Do you
hear
share that view for all of Latin America?
Yes, I do. I'm reading right now the 8th volume of the Cortes of Cádiz that took place in 1811. And I don't know, most people don't know, but what we call Latin America today, from 1492, as they advanced, the Spanish and Portuguese advanced into the mainland, all of that area was one colony. Actually, they called it the provinces, right, of Spain. But all of that was one until each one of the areas became independent, roughly in the 19th century, beginning in the first quarter of the 19th century, ending with Cuba in 1898. Remember the Maine? But yes, it is basically the same. Regardless, Argentinians tell themselves to be the whitest nation on the south of the Rio Bravo. Costa Ricans claim that too. Dominicans would like to claim that, and so do Puerto Ricans, but Mexicans have it. We are, if you notice that photograph, you know, yes. Okay? Yes.
The focus on dark skin is not only a Latin question. It's also among people on the Indian subcontinent. It's among other people who have native blood. What do you see as being particular about the Mexican experience of that color?
Colorism?
Melanin
Yeah,
charge.
colorism, yes,
Yeah,
thank you very
yeah,
much.
colorism.
Go ahead.
Colorism, I've seen it in our own family experience, and in Mexico, where people are told that they can't have a certain job because they don't fit the image. In Mexico, when we lived in Mexico, I often saw advertisements that you have to turn in a photograph as part of your application process. So there's certain images, and of course the media has a lot of control over that. In the U.S., we've opened up a little bit more. I mean, there's a lot of change still needed in the United States. The stereotyping through images in our media, but in Mexico, and I would say from Latin America, but because Latin America, we consume the same media, so the soap operas that are produced in Argentina, people watch in Mexico. Right, the soap operas produced in Venezuela are watched in other parts of Latin America. So, and they shared the same history. They shared the same control of the idea of divide and conquer. The groups, with the old term is the Willie Lynch. But within the same family, you will have preferred preference children over others because of according to their hue, good hair, bad hair. That's throughout Latin America. The whitening cream we talked about, even the Nivea cream being sold to lighten your skin. There's this product, and here it's actually to brown, to make us brown. But it's the same issues, I think, throughout the Americas. And in our experience, again, back to you're told what your possibilities are based on what you look like. What I saw in the public transportation often was you'll have mothers with their children, but they'll make really positive comments about my child, and it's kind of a comparison to their child. Yeah, I mean, like when our firstborn, it was like, oh, he looks like Jesus, but her child was a lot different and didn't look like Jesus. The theory of, the modern time image of what Jesus is, which is another whole topic that we could, that imagery of through the belief systems, yeah. And Dr. Hernández has researched how historical figures, revolutionary figures, their skin has been lightened in the textbooks and in paintings, so there aren't images really that society can look towards with pride as far as the African roots, yeah.
But another thing that it's very, very important about this site, Mexico, is that this history of melanin charge before India was in Mexico. Europe extended itself throughout the whole world. Wherever Europe touched, we have this problem, okay? But Mexico was one of the first places where this was instituted. And I'm not an expert on India, but Ronoko Rashidi, a good friend of mine, is. And, we've looked into some of these issues. And, before the India, a great nation, had their caste division in the way we understand it today, Mexico had a caste division too. And we actually had in Mexico up to 64 subdivisions. 16 are the ones that are publicized, but if you go into research deeper, you find these other subdivisions, which are not only absurd, but they really are shocking to the mind. That's why Mexico is so important, because anyone who wants to study the results of this European mythology, they are there. They are alive and well. And by the way, we do have a population, a very large population in Mexico of African descendant people still, although they claim that the African genes were recessive, and because of it, our Africanness had disappeared. That's what the first minister of education, Jose Vasconcelos, the founder of the National University too, in 1921 proposed. And this is the mentality that is still being taught at school, that, although there were, among our ancestors were a lot of Africans, these Africans disappear through integration. And so, meanwhile, the hundreds of thousands of black Mexicans who are found throughout the country, but mainly on the Pacific coast, are not recognized as an ethnic group. And we have been fighting very hard to receive this recognition, because as you would know, of course, the distribution of funds does not occur in the case of Afro-Mexicans because they don't exist. And so this is a terrible problem in many instances.
I want to add that it's amazing to me that the centuries of enslavement that took place throughout the Americas has been so erased from the history or the knowledge, or not much less. I mean, very important, the recognition, but also that the people's identity. It's a double thing. It's mind warping that you can see such presence there in the culture. To me, it's like psychological twisting to see the dance and the music, not to mention the food and even the intellectual capacity of people, and not see any link. I mean, just outright denial. When we mention it, I mean, we've had discussions with Marco's family, and it's like, you're making me black, and it's like, I mean, it's the turnoff. Is so great, and I know, thinking of our audience, when one looks at, I'm not a scientist, being from the humanities background, but when you look at asking people to self-identify, that they're going to, by habit, mark white. I mean, they're just going to, but yet historically and even behaviorally, even if we looked at the genome, there's this African influence. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people were brought from Africa for hundreds of years.
What was the difference? What was the numbers? To the United States and to Latin America?
Yeah,
Go ahead. Every person that was brought here, for every person, a conservative number is 25 down there. Mm-hmm. Brazil alone received somewhere in between 4.5 to 5 million, just 10 times the amount of people that were brought here. Cuba, in the 19th century alone, received as many people as the United States did in the whole history. That's why Cubans are the way they are. They still is a fresh memory. People were ripped from Nigeria, Ghana region, and brought in there to work as in a prison-like environment. And they had to labor in the sugar plantations. And when I told this to my mentor, to my professor in British Columbia, I was told to be easy about it, because I was saying it was like a prison. Oh, no, nothing like that, They were telling me to bring down the tone. And, how can you bring down the tone in a conversation like that?
The First Nations populations were decimated within the first 70 years. And Dr. Hernández has researched, and we've shared together the fact that those populations, the culture remained somewhat intact, but the population numbers were reconstituted through mixing with the Africans that were brought. So you'll find that a lot of even if they're speaking a First Nations language within Latin America, the populations were again brought back to a healthy number and able to sustain themselves through the influx of the Africans that were brought, that were ripped from their culture and replanted into a still surviving culture and environment, connected to the land. And a functioning language. So that's why when one looks even, not to rely only on looks, but one can see that there is actually, if one opens one's eyes, a heavy African presence throughout the Americas once one is prepared to see it.
In 2010, I worked on a theory that would replace the so-called miscegenation theory. That's what Mexico officially recognizes as miscegenation. We are miscegenated people. I've always told people I'm a full human being. I'm not half anything, right? And so I had to work on a theory, and I call it the Africanization. The Africanization of Mexico, from the 16th century onwards. And I review various bits of evidence. I review, for instance, food. I review dance, I review cosmic visions, how we understand the universe being formed. It is incredible when I began traveling to West Africa and I saw how similar we were. I did some research on how rice arrived from West Africa to Mexico. And people would have us believe that it came from Asia. There are 20 types of grasses around the equator belt in the planet that have been with us for the longest period. Now, the Asian type controls today because of its sturdiness. But before then, it was what was called red rice that controlled this area, this region. So Mexico, until late into the colonial period, actually consumed red rice. And so was Colombia, so was Venezuela, so was Brazil, and even the Carolinas. The people who brought the knowledge on rice here came from West Africa, from the same Senegambia region. And this had occurred in Mexico a couple hundred years earlier. So rice arrived in Mexico with Christopher Columbus, with Hernán Cortés. They are all the same. But Hernán Cortés was not worried at all about the rice. This is what shocked me when I started reading documents. He was very concerned about 4 grains of wheat that were inside of a sack of rice. And then I asked, rice? Who's that for? Right? And then I started realizing that there were a lot of rice-eating individuals in the Cortés party. And anybody would think, oh, okay, paella. Paella is the dish of Spain, no? Paella did not become a dish of Spain until the 19th century. And actually, rice is a Muslim grain. It is not a Christian grain because it entered the Iberian Peninsula about year 1000.
With the Moors.
It stayed, with the Moors, with the Black Moors, and it stayed there, unknown to the majority of the people in the peninsula until the 19th century. But nevertheless, it was food, it was customs, the way we behave, that gave me the clue on how African we really are. And I would say West African, because there is a heavy influence in Mexico of West Africa, specifically.
Especially being a chef. I mean, at least I have a very, pat idea of what Mexican food is all about because I go down to a restaurant and eat Mexican restaurant. What influences in that cuisine came from Africa?
And what you're familiar with here?
Yes.
what we would eat here? Well, as Dr. Hernández mentioned, the rice,
Yes.
Definitely, which again, here we recognize it was South Carolina's African influence, and Latin America is far from being able to recognize something like that. But when Dr. Hernández went to Senegal and he was offered these common drinks, he was like, oh my gosh, this is what we drink in our homes by the pitcherful, which is the Jamaica.
Rosel.
Here we have Jamaica now available, which is Rosel, another name for Jamaica, hibiscus tea. And that's originally from the West African region. And in Mexico, they're consuming this, I mean, in every household. It's a common drink, and they don't see the tie. And the other big one is tamarind. It's a brown drink. It's a brown fruit, dried, huge. They're huge trees with these pod-like seeds that, well, they're pods, and then it's the pulp from the pod. That's drank throughout Mexico. Can't speak further.
Laxative. The one thing
It's very, and it cleans the liver. I mean, there are all of kinds of good things about this. But again, back to if you have any of those drinks while here, those are the ties to
right, and rice.
to the
rice water, the three national waters, and I would dare say just about most of Latin America, tamarind, rosel, or we call it Jamaica, because it came through Jamaica to us, and then rice water, horchata.
horchata, the horchata.
But
drink.
not only that.
The chivo,
the
the
peanut
tamarind.
butters too. You know, West Africans have these ground nuts, they call it, right? Peanuts went back from the Americas to Africa in the early part of this exchange. And then they adopted it and developed their own cuisine. So when I come over there, and one of
So
the
that
times-
was the influence from here to
Right,
there.
so I am in West Africa, and I'm going through a line, and they give me a plate of rice with this beautiful brown stew on top of it, and everybody's looking at me to see what I'm going to say about it. So I go sit down and move the soda pop aside, no Fanta, and I get a Gazelle beer right next to me and start eating it. And people ask me, what do you think? And I said, you're missing the tortillas, right? But this what shocked me the most is that it tasted so much like mole. And I grew up, I would fight if anybody told me that mole was not from Mexico, that the Spanish nuns had invented mole. I knew that. You know, and mole is this sauce that we put chocolate in it, right? And it's like a barbecue sauce when you really start thinking about it. And when you come to this region and you taste the ribs, good barbecue ribs, you know there is a relationship between mole, the barbecue sauce over here, and West African. You know, unless you're a real derelict, you would not be able to tell. I'm sorry, no, but you know, I mean, I had students ask me, do Mexican people have soul food?
Oh my goodness.
Mexican food is soul food.
Right, right. And then the inclusion of fat and the frying. Actually, the frying, which we can recognize, I think, here in the United States, but the deep fat frying. I mean, when tilapia. I don't know if you've ever had a whole tilapia from a restaurant here in the United States. It's served exactly the same way. The same way. I mean, even with the slices. They have better, even the way the fish is cut at an angle and fried, the display on the plate, it's the very, very same thing. Yeah, and you were talking about the Wolof rice. You know, the Mexican rice here is red and with sometimes with vegetables in it served, and it's the same. It's served the same way in Africa.
Recently, they have been talking about which Wolof rice is better, whether it's Nigerian, Ghanaian, Senegalese, or Mexican. Mm-hmm. You know, because Mexican Wolof rice too, although we call it arroz a la mexicana, it really is Wolof rice. And this I didn't discover this. Dr. Ian Smart in Howard was the one that gave me the clue sometime back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the intersection of race and ethnicity? So I feel like those terms get confused quite a bit, and
Right.
I agree. I mean, race is sort of the social construct, not a real thing. is ethnicity a real thing? And
Well,
how do those,
ethnicity is the product of experience.
right,
Okay, so that's a very real thing. If you live in a certain area of the planet that has all of these beautiful things available to you, you pretty much develop a way of adapting to those things, to the ground, and more than likely you end up constructing a round house with palm thatch, and go and get some bananas, and if you do have some animals, draw the milk from the animals, so forth, so on. So you develop an ethnicity, or we'll call it nationality, if you will, because of all of these customs. And then people dance because they think that there's a fertility thing that one has to dance to. If they notice that if they dance, the moon will come out, so they develop all these customs around that. So that's an ethnic thing. The race thing is just an invention of the Spaniards. And that's why Mexico is important too, because Mexico is the place where this ideology was deployed, and it seemed to have been frozen. It stayed there. We do believe in this. We have the race issue, just like the United States, very deep inside of us, right? And the United States, of course, adopted that, not the United States, but Britain adopted that from the Spanish. The Spanish were the ones, Spanish and Portuguese were the ones who started all of this stuff. Everybody else followed suit, right? Actually, Britain started to police the oceans in the mid-1800s, stopping that. I used to think, yeah, but it was not out of the goodness of their heart. I think that they wanted to get at the colonies here for cutting themselves off. They say, yeah, you don't want to be with us. You're not going to have any of what you have been having until now. But that's another presentation. So the ethnicity and race are, you can find in the Yunga in Bolivia, African-looking people who wear the indigenous garb, who speak the indigenous language, and who do no other thing than the ethnic things that people did in the place. And so I believe that, I don't know if you have seen the images of Indians in New Orleans, black Indians during the carnival. There are a lot of people who dress like Indians and dance and parade in New Orleans. And this is a case, black Indians exist all throughout the continent. Actually, the foremost expert, Jack D. Forbes, on this issue of Indian and black, has said that in one region of the continent, people tend to look African, but they are just as much indigenous as African. In another side of the continent is the opposite. I don't agree with him totally on that, because Tumaco Pacific, and the Pacific side of Mexico, Pacific side of Peru, and even Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, you find a lot of so-called African-looking people. But I do believe that the majority of the indigenous people who claim to be the originary people from here are just as much African as most of the Africans who are here. So this continent is a place where every gene that came from everywhere, it's present here. The majority of the genes in this continent are African and originary, but we also carry a lot of European and Asian.
And I think that race is more exclusive. It's very defined, it's very stringent, whereas ethnicity, it kind of implies a more plethora of human expression and cultures, right? And that though it does have a charge to the word, because ethnic is everything other than Caucasian for some reason in a lot of usages, right? So it doesn't always, but yeah, ethnic food, it's like, well, what is that? Well, it's probably not steak and potatoes, right? So yeah.
Well, we're starting to, I just got to be ethnic German.
Yeah, ethnic German, right?
Or ethnic Italian, or ethnic Spanish, or ethnic Catalan.
But it's good to have this question because it questions the terminology. Yes. What terminology is being used, and as humans come more and more with diverse backgrounds, and even some backgrounds we don't even understand, that we don't even know, but yet we're living it. right? Cultures that we're carrying on in our daily lives, and we don't understand the history behind it. These cultures coming together, and we don't have the terminology. We're actually, our terminology is so antiquated, and we're going at such a rapid pace of change. That we're coming together to live very close together, and our environment is changing. Our language as human beings used to be tied to the land because we lived on that land for millennia, and our language, was created out of the need to function within that land and the environment, right? And now we're still. Language was invented in order to explain differences or control, the others, and we're the it, right? So now we're at a loss to create language quickly, and where other people understand it, right? And then within research, well, that's a big question. How do you define, again, back to that, the idea of cohort? How do people self-identify, and how does the research, how reliable is the research that comes out of that self-identifying when it's relying on language that has been recently developed? And by that I mean, like you're a mestizo. Well, if you're, la raza. If you're a mestizo, then that means you're a mix of two races, which implies the purity of two races. And yet those, the purity of those people, when you go back to the origins, they didn't have any, they were also mixed. I mean, a pure Spanish race, from Spain. I mean, if you look at Catalonia now, what's going on, I don't think so. And all of the mixture of peoples and cultures in Spain. So Africa is one, people, or the indigenous populations is one people. So, yeah, it's more complicated than that. But science wants to make it specific in order to measure. Yeah. Good question.
There seems to me to be a tremendous sort of tension between, we spoke with the founder of the National University and how Africans disappeared through breeding, and then the lament that there aren't African Mexicans, but that they're not recognized as an ethnic group. So how do we resolve that kind of tension between people who are wanting and desiring to be other and the need to recognize the identity of an ethnic group?
Right. Well, there are no easy solutions to something this complicated. But the one thing that I've been able to observe in the Latin American countries I have traveled, I mentioned Cuba, which I love very much. I discovered that the same problem that we have in Mexico or that exists in Argentina is in Cuba, notwithstanding this great revolution from my view. Okay, and I've been reading about it and went to the bad education. Carl Woodson, what he said, about the education of African Americans in the United States, that miseducation is the same thing that occurred all throughout Latin America. With the recent bringing down of Lee's monuments, we have that all throughout Latin America. All our museums, if you walk into a museum, you'll see exactly what I am talking about. If you look at these monuments, you'll see what I'm talking about. We are questioning right now, today, in a majority indigenous black population, celebrating Christopher Columbus. What did he do? Right? And this is the horrible, horrible thing. Now, it would have to be a curricular change all the way from kindergarten to the university. We need to, and this needs to be done to decolonize the mind all over the world. This same problem I found in various countries in Africa. I found that in various countries in Latin America. This has been my experience in the United States. Everywhere where Europe touched that I have been, I have noticed exactly the same situations. We are responding to a history that is man-made, that is not based on fact, or better yet, is based on their facts. And we need to find creative ways to do research. I was told when I started that I was out of luck. There wasn't much in the archives. The archives that the Spaniards kept were not reliable. Well, the fact is that we, as human beings, speak a language. The language is an archive. We have a culture, cultures. Cultures are archives. The way we do things have been passed on to us through generations, the way we view the world. So those sources can be archives too, paintings, sculptures, the way we cook, right? Some of those great dishes that the Irish people eat, right? Sort of like entrails, or the British, you know, that blood pudding, you know, delicious moronga, we call it. So we can discover a lot more about our humanity by changing the curriculum, and this would help quite a bit to reform that mythological understanding that resulted in the mistaken identity syndrome that Mexico suffers, and Mexicans here and in Mexico suffer as well.
Dr. Hernández has there's a video that starts out with memory and modernity, and it talks about among other things in the video, San Juan de Ulua fortress that is one of the first fortresses that was built by slaves, enslaved people in Veracruz, on the coast of Veracruz. And the point, a couple things that I'd like to add here is one, that with the idea of modernity is to look to Europe and Europeanize. And that means that you're forward-looking and that you're improving your society. I'm going to make a little insert here, like marry up, which is actually to mejorar la raza, is to marry more Caucasian. It's still in the mindset even of the newborn. That takes you towards modernity. And backwardness is the opposite. And so it really is, you know, a mindset of a nation. Here we have people within Mexico that want to be identified as African descendant with different terms, whether they want to be called black or whatever those communities want to call themselves. But the central, you know, the majority of the people, oh, no, we don't have any, you know, that's not us. We don't want to identify with them because that would take Mexico back into the Dark Ages, because modernity is looking towards Europe. To be civilized is to be European.
White aesthetic.
White aesthetic. So there's a lot of political outlash against, you know, being recognized, and being recognized is a big thing because that means you have the right to protect your culture. It's bigger than just a plaque on the wall or something coming out of the national government. You know, so I wanted to make sure, and that's also why people would identify themselves in any kind of survey as being Caucasian, because I'm modern, I'm forward-thinking, I'm, you know, not backward. I'm going to be associated with what's positive, unfortunately. Did I answer your question a little bit with it? Yeah.
And this video is on the YouTube channel?
It's on Marco Polo Hernández Cuevas YouTube. It's the first one that we did, yeah. San Juan de Ulua Fortress, it's a huge fortress. It began to be built 500 years ago. It has a large museum in it. Does not have any mention that it was a slave market, that it held slaves, that it was built by enslaved people. I have to change my terminology. I'm working on that. So you go, Marco used to be, Dr. Hernández used to be taken there as a young man, to the port city of Veracruz. And as a young person, he didn't even realize what that port meant until leaving Mexico and studying and then going back. And here's this community that you see they're Afro-descendants, the entire community. And yet people are in denial.
Well, people in this community do recognize Africa, and many people do love Africa and actually practice a lot of the very deep African, like Santeria. But the majority of people don't, and when this is practiced, it's in private. It's not a public thing.
And I'm just amazed at the museum itself not having a word It's like, how can you erase 250 years of history? I find that amazing. Questions?
This is a
Comments?
great class.
We're so good at what we did that we answered all of your questions. Nothing came to mind? Our opinions?
I could speak a whole lifetime about this. I just like to see what points of interest maybe you have. The one thing that I like you to keep in mind when you visit with any issue that has to do with Latinos, just think about that. Think that we are not an homogeneous people at all. Think about that, a very important part, I think the most important part of Latin America, of course I make a living out of it, it's the African heritage, not only of Mexico, but of Latin America. Right? Think that the greatest negation that exists among Latinos is that part of our being. And that there is a reason for that too. The Spanish stigmatized Africa. That's how they justified the genocide they perpetrated. And this is something that, when one comes into contact with Latino people, one has to be patient and understand the negation. You can see somebody who is very black looking, and they tell you they have nothing to do with Africa. And you have to respect that. Right? If they tell you they are Spanish, believe them. Right? However, there is a psychological problem there. And I have seen, for instance, we've been at North Carolina Central University now for 12 years, and students have had student organizations, Afro-Latino organization, and the majority of Latin American students don't want to belong to this organization. They created another organization called Raíces, Roots. And, as much as I like to erase that and just have one organization, I'm observing what they are doing and why they are doing it. And we are at a historically black college. They came to a historically black college because they feel more comfortable there than they would feel in a non-historically black college. And I asked, why would you be different than black Latinos then? I asked my colleagues that too, themselves. I asked my African American colleagues, for instance, why do you wear uncomfortable clothing? I see everybody with suits and ties and 100-degree weather. And somebody told me, I have to look different than the other person. They don't realize that a suit made such a difference. If I wear a suit, people think I'm a pimp. They don't think I'm a professor. Well, I don't know. We have these ideas about people, the way people look. And that's the point, We have a saying in Spanish, las apariencias engañan. And something like, don't judge a book by its cover in English. As one is serving a diverse community, one has to be conscious of people, this negation, and that's the result of stigmatization. You also have to be aware that people can be from Uruguay, the central part of South America, and be black. Right? Because there were African people brought to that region. Actually, anywhere where a Spanish person was, they have to have somebody who did the work. And guess who did the work? So we'll leave it at that, unless you have some more questions. Now, come on, I'm getting paid for it.
Something came to mind, a little recent story that we were told that there are a lot of people from the Costa Chica in this region, and especially Winston-Salem. Costa Chica they identify themselves as black. Not the whole population, there are indigenous populations there as well. It's isolated south of Acapulco. And so we've been in contact with a family there, and we visited, and vice versa. They've come to visit with us from Costa Chica. And there was a story that or an experience that the family shared with us where when they met some of their the people from their community when they came to visit here with us, and they went to Winston-Salem to some family reunions there in Winston-Salem, and there was a person that works with Hispanics from Mexico, but would never identify himself as black. So he didn't want to be mistreated or felt to be other, one of the other. So he was, we say, passing, right, as being just the regular mestizo. And he was actually brought to tears to be able to communicate and connect with people that identified themselves as black, because that's how he identifies himself. But here, in order to get along with the group of people that he was working with, he could not identify himself as who he was. And I find that that's a lot to carry. When every day when you go out, especially if there are terms or jokes and things that go on and you can't express your opinion about that directly, right, among your population that you're living with and you're working with. Yeah. So that's moving for a young man to come to tears when the experience of being able to release, that he was holding back for so long, the years that he'd been working here and away from his community. Mm-hmm.
I need to even open my mouth because I feel so unable to. I thank you so much for this presentation. It's been incredible. But I'm just wondering, like as an American and what we see in America, I've stopped watching TV like 20 years ago, and I wouldn't take my kids to Disney. I mean, it's expensive, and I don't want to invest in that. And and I don't want to belittle what you're saying, but like our Barbie dolls, it took us years to get a brown-haired Barbie, And now we have all these princesses, but all these princesses look so much like an American princess, even like Jasmine. And yesterday I went to Toys R Us, and they all had these elongated faces, even the foreign princesses. And I'm like, why do we take our little kids to Disney? I mean, everybody takes their little kids to Disney like it's some sort of ritual, and I just find that appalling. So I guess I don't identify with a lot of this stuff. I haven't watched TV in a long time, and when I do, it's all these people that have way more money than I'll ever imagine, having crises that I'm not interested in. Yeah, but I mean, it's just amazing to me, like even from my perspective here, that we support that. It's almost like our little god to have ourselves entertained by these perfect-ish people that all look alike, and it's kind of nauseating, but we invest it, and then we expose our kids to that. So.
I would tell my students, I am the Mexican version of Kent. I come with a six-pack on hand, right? And that was precisely that perception. United States diversity, just like European diversity, you can look different but think the same way, right? So the difference is not being ethnically who you are, but it's just, the differences of appearances. So in other words, you can have in Europe, in Spain, let's do so that I don't see. In Spain, you can have 40 million people divided into 14 major ethnicities, right? And that's acceptable. But negro, that is black, we just don't understand that as any diversity. Actually, the greatest sin that Europeans committed when they came into contact in 1444 with West Africans was to reduce whatever they saw to their ignorance. Over 2 million years of experience, of human experience, that was contained in the people they were meeting was erased when they called them negros. Instead of calling people, when people say, well, my ancestors are Yoruba, or my ancestors are Serere, or my ancestors are Fulani or Mandingo, why not? One of the 100+ people, why not? Because we haven't taken the time to study. The majority of people If I ask people in any room, I go around and I want to do the test here, right? But when I ask people, do you know how many countries in Africa? I asked students the other day, have you ever thought of the size of Nigeria? Do you know how many different nations are contained in that country? Do you know how much oil they have? Do you know how many other resources? We don't know anything about Africa. When was the last time you saw a positive news on any African country? Any. When was the last time? When we hear about any of these places, we hear about it when something horrible has happened. And why is that? Disneyland. We actually call it the McDonaldization of the experience. But I was telling students about thinking outside the box.
Yeah,
And basically that's what it is, thinking outside of the idiot box, right?
yeah. So I guess we're done. Yeah, terminamos. Okay, thank you so much for having us here. It's been a pleasure.